All right, well, let me give you a quick introduction to myself and what I do. Firstly, a big qualifier is my background is not computer science or software engineering or anything technical like that. I'm actually come from a background of cognitive science and psychology. That's what my research is. And my research has all been focused on tackling the problem of misinformation through a psychology lens. But trying to tackle that problem inevitably led me to collaborating with computer scientists, political scientists, critical thinking philosophers, people in a whole range of other disciplines, all working together trying to come up with complicated interdisciplinary solutions. So it's really taken me out of my comfort zone, outside my lane in a way, working with people in other areas. And one of the main things we've been working on in the last couple of years has been what we call in my biz, in the misinformation research world, the holy grail of fact-checking, which is automatic detection and debunking of misinformation in real time. That's the ultimate. That's what we're aiming for. One of the reasons being that misinformation spreads faster than accurate information. Like, it gets shared more. It's more interesting usually because it's not bound by the truth. It gets shared more deeply, and once it gets out there and spreads out, it's really hard to undo the damage. And there's a lot of psychology research into why that. And I'm happy to get into that later on if people have questions. Did you have a question, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, you might have it in the slides, but I'm just wondering if you can define misinformation and disinformation. And
right. Yeah, so I usually use the term misinformation, which broadly speaking is just all claims that are false, that are not based on fact. And then disinformation is a subsection of that, which are false claims that are intentionally meant to deceive. Whereas misinformation could be intentional, or it could be people genuinely believe it, but they're just spouting wrong stuff. So misinformation is kind of the umbrella, and then you have disinformation underneath that. And again, this is part of my work, has looked at how, from the outside, misinformation and disinformation are really hard to tell the difference of, to tell the difference between, because the techniques used in disinformation, like intentional techniques like cherry picking or using fake experts, those techniques are the same techniques that people will use if they genuinely believe something, but they're just biased. So they cherry pick because of confirmation bias, or they rely on fake experts because they're telling them the things that they want to believe. So from the outside, people are using these same techniques, and you can't tell the difference between intentional deception and self-deception. So practically, I tend to just use the term misinformation because of that practical difficulty. But I'm kind of digressing already. You've already got me going off on a side track there, Adam. So yeah, sure.
So if disinformation or misinformation, you must know the truth.
Right. I mean, that's a good question too, and this is another sidetrack. But so
how you get the truth?
Right, and I've focused on climate misinformation, so I'll speak to that topic because that's kind of the shallow end of the pool. There's a lot of stuff there that is a lot more factual and easier to fact check or debunk compared to policy issues or societal issues where there's cultural values. That's a lot more difficult. So I steer clear of that stuff. But when you get to issues like climate change, a lot of it is just scientific consensus, settled science stuff that we've known for decades. But then even within climate change, there's like policy arguments or other issues where it's a little bit more murky and difficult. And I don't get into this much or at all really tonight, but the way that we've been tackling that particular question, and this is, I think, a general principle, how do you fact check something when it's hard to know the facts? The way we approach it is we look at claims through a critical thinking lens, and you can use critical thinking to systematically identify whether a claim or an argument contains reasoning fallacies, logical fallacies, or rhetorical techniques that are misleading. And so just identifying misleading techniques in an argument for us is sufficient to flag information as potentially problematic. So it kind of sidesteps your issue in a way, because sometimes you can't. And so anyway, I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole here.
Yes, how you accumulate all these like flags for that? It's like spam filtering, something like that. Categorize something.
It is. It's kind of like, well, here is a red flag. This is using this particular technique. And and part of what we do is using AI to do that. So let me jump into the presentation and we'll
Thank you.
and we'll, hopefully we'll come back around, circle around to doing it. Now because my background is psychology, and I began my career and for many years was just running psychology experiments where we were testing different ways to debunk misinformation or pre-bunk misinformation, just testing different messaging formats and what is the most effective way to actually undo the damage of misinformation. And then, I don't know, a couple of years ago, I got contacted by some computer scientists from Exeter, from the UK. And so they were working on a machine learning way of analysing climate misinformation, but it was what they call unsupervised machine learning. So it's not, it's just basically topic analysis. It's just saying, let's look at all, hundreds of thousands of papers and just automatically extract what are the topics that climate deniers are talking about. And so I looked at their paper, but then my response was, this is useful academically, but what would be really cool and practical in the real world would be, I didn't say the real world because it sounds a bit dicky, but what would be really practical would be training a machine to detect specific misinformation claims. Because I was thinking holy grail, like then if we could detect misinformation claims, we can then detect and debunk and be able to address misinformation as it comes online. And so we worked together for a couple of years on a paper which we published in 2021, where we trained the machine learning model to detect climate misinformation claims. That's it. And to your question on what is fact or not, we completely dodged that. We were explicit about that in the paper. We said, because we started with a corpus or a data set scraped from climate denier blogs and conservative think tank websites, which are two of the most prolific sources of climate misinformation. But all we were doing was documenting what do they say, what are their claims. We were not determining whether those claims were true or not, factual or not. It was just about detection. And so the first step to do this was we had to develop a taxonomy of what were the types of claims that they made on these websites, contrarian claims, we called it. And we found that there were 5 categories of claims coming from climate deniers. The first 3 were science-based. Climate change isn't real. It's not caused by humans. It's not bad. The 4th category was about climate solutions, saying that they won't work. And then the 5th category was just attacking science, attacking either climate science, attacking climate models, or attacking scientists themselves, just personal attacks on scientists. And so once we developed this taxonomy, we then took, about 28,000 randomly selected examples from our data set, and then just went through the process of looked at each text and then mapped it to a claim, and then repeat and repeat until we had created a large enough training set that our model performed well in accurately detecting and categorizing misinformation claims. Yes.
Hi. Yeah. Just out of interest, did you have a statistical proportion of like ad hominem attacks versus climate denial versus other bits? It would say a lot about the psychology of the people that you're mining the data set from.
Which of these categories were the most common?
Yeah.
Got a side for that actually. So because once we had trained our machine, then we were able to put 20 years of misinformation claims into our model, and it spat out a time series. Basically, it spat out a history of climate misinformation claims. And we found that the category 5, attacking science and scientists, was one of the biggest categories. But really, and that was one of the things that jumped out of this. But the other thing that jumped out of this was the increasing trend towards solutions arguments. Now, the reason I got into this was originally I was just debunking all the science arguments. Global warming is caused by the sun, or it's cold, therefore global warming isn't real. Those kinds of arguments, right? And it turns out those were actually a small proportion compared to attacking science and solutions arguments. So this was in conservative think tank websites. When we looked at climate denial blogs, science is unreliable was the highest. It was well above the others. And we recently just did an analysis of Twitter climate misinformation. I don't have a slide for it, but science is like, wow, it's like 40% of all misinformation tweets about climate change are ad hominem attacks on scientists. And then the next 20% are conspiracy theories. So more than half of all tweets about climate misinformation tweets are attacking scientists or conspiracy theories. So it's my sense is the shorter the message, the more feral it seems to get. So this is actually the most behaved of all climate misinformation. It just gets more and more. What's that? Yeah, think tanks. Because think tanks are these, lawyers in suits writing white papers and writing books.
60% of them were ad hominem attacks.
No, that was tweets. Tweets were 60%, right? So so this was the thing about this research though was like it was a really insightful paper, and it's great to create a history of climate misinformation using this machine learning model. But really, I was interested in this holy grail end goal of detecting misinformation and then doing something once you detect it. What you do, I'm not sure. Now, and I thought once you had done this detection problem solved, it was the holy grail was solved. Like you're done and dusted. And I could not be more wrong about that. So, and I should have known because my background is psychology, and working with a whole bunch of psychology experts, we wrote the Debunking Handbook in 2020, where we summarized all the psych research into how do you debunk effectively. So it's how do you debunk misinformation in a way that's actually going to stop people believing in the misinformation. And if I could summarize it in one little slide, it would be this. If you're going to debunk misinformation, you want to do a couple of things. Firstly, you want to put the emphasis on the facts, and not just random facts or just throwing facts at people. You want to identify the fact that dislodges the myth in people's minds. Because when you tell people that thing you believe is wrong, and you're basically reaching into their mind and taking that out of their mental model, you're creating a gap in their mental model. And people don't like gaps. And if you don't fill that gap with a replacement fact, then what research has found is people just go back to believing the myth again. It's called the continued influence effect. Yes?
Question. Is this a little bit like deep learning people?
Yeah, I think that's a bit more involved and deeper, but there's probably similar dynamics where you do need to, and this is again something outside my area, but my perception of that is that you do need to, it's not just telling them to stop doing this or stop believing that, but you need to replace it with an alternative belief system or an alternative lifestyle or whatever it is required to deprogram. So in this case, yeah, you do need to take the myth that you're debunking and replace it with a fact that slots into their mental model, but fits into the mental model even better than the myth did. Right, let me give you a tangible example. Let's say the myth, the sun is causing global warming. If you tell them, okay, no, that can't be true because the sun has been cooling for the last 50 years while global warming's been happening. So it's impossible that the sun is causing global warming. You've shown that that myth cannot be true, but having created that gap, now you need to replace it with what is causing global warming. So then you would need to find that factual replacement that slots into people's mental models. So that's just the first bit. And that's quite hard. It's non-trivial to identify that replacement fact that dislodges the myth that you're trying to debunk. Yes?
Oh, is it okay if I have?
Yes, yeah, definitely. No, you can ask questions during, but probably just wait till Adam gives you the microphone, so then you can speak into that.
What if the fact that I'm giving them is it's so radical that they can't really accept? Do we need to replace the myth, the misleading myth, with something less radical that they?
Radical. I mean, can you give an example of what you mean?
Well, for them it is radical, not for us.
Yeah, I mean, so, well, maybe not. See, there's the kind of general rule of thumb with the whole fact replacement thing is because misinformation is sticky. It's hard to dislodge. It's often easy to remember. It's just sticky information. But the general rule of thumb is you want to fight that sticky myth with an even stickier fact. So you want to take your fact, which often facts are pretty boring.
And make it memeable.
I mean, you kind of, yes. So facts can often be abstract, nuanced, complicated, difficult for people to get their heads around, or maybe radical. But what you need to do is communicate the fact in a way that is still accurate, but in a way that is sticky, compelling, memorable, engaging to people. So an example would be the myth global warming stopped in 2015, which is something on the internet, because 2015 or 2016 was the hottest year on record until 2023, I think, passed it. But anyway, they've been using it for the last few years. One way to debunk that is to communicate to people that since 2015, and in fact since the last few decades, the planet has been building up heat at a rate of 4 atomic bombs per second. That's how much energy is building up in the climate system. And there's lots of ways you could communicate that information. You know, you could talk about radiative forcing and energy imbalances and lots of nuanced, complicated ways that would go over people's heads. But a sticky way to communicate it, making it simple, taking people by surprise with unexpected information, which radical information might be, is 4 atomic bombs per second is actually how much heat is accumulating in our climate system.
So anything that involves explosions, giant like teeth or dinosaurs or stuff like that, anything that belongs in the Hollywood category.
Right. Yeah, it does sound like a Hollywood movie. And then the other important element of debunking misinformation is you need to explain how the misinformation actually distorts the facts. What is the fallacy or the rhetorical technique that the misinformation uses? And one of the reasons you need to do that is because when you communicate, all right, here is my key fact. The planet's been warming at a rate of 4 atomic bombs per second. But there's this myth that says that global warming stopped in 2015. Those are two conflicting pieces of information. And the danger is when people receive two conflicting pieces of information and they have no way of resolving that conflict, then they can just disengage and believe neither. It's like, oh, it's too hard, I don't know. I don't know what to believe. But if you explain, well, the way that the myth distorts the facts is it uses the technique of cherry picking or misrepresentation or oversimplification or whatever, then it helps people make sense of these two conflicting pieces of information. Did you have a question?
Yes. This seems super plausible and super sensible way to attack the problem. But I'm interested, how did you come up with this as a solution? Is there like a statistical background or any evidence to say this works and we tried lots of other things and they didn't?
Yeah, so the debunking handbook is basically a summary of all the psychology research testing, like some of my studies and other people all over the world testing all these different formats, communicating facts, communicating fallacies, etc. And this is kind of distilling a whole body of research.
So there's a lot of psychology research that goes into the
Yeah.
debunking handbook?
Yes, so it's just, I think, if you just go to that address at the top of the slide. Yeah, and actually, I'll share the slides with Adam if you want to share it around with everyone else.
Sure. Happy to, yeah.
So, and the debunking, I don't know, it's about a dozen pages. It's very concise, but a shit ton of references at the back. So if you want to chase up all the research that it's based on. Yes.
So now AI is so popular, right? So you can ask questions and then give you kind of like answer looks very like facts.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Like, for example, how you going to let how would I say, like help people to know, to recognize or identify that's the fact, like because everything from TV, from social media, from AI probably can be like can be wrong. Where can we find fact then?
Yeah, I mean,
An extension
Yeah.
to that question after. Well, you can go.
Yeah, like I'm just saying, like okay, you can say you have these ways to like convince people this is a fact, but the thing is, who's going to convince us? We're going to be the channel.
right. And we were talking about spam filters earlier. Like, in terms of knowledge, the best spam filter is peer-reviewed science, where you have experts in the field reviewing what other experts are saying. It's not foolproof, but scientific papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals.
But it's not accessible easily, right?
No, and
Yeah.
so a lot of the
So if
work
you're-
I do is about trying to make peer-reviewed science accessible, and hopefully the thing that I'm talking about tonight will also make this kind of work accessible. Did you have a follow-up question,
Well,
Adam?
indeed, yes, because that's really interesting. It's one of the I brought this up before with you over the phone, and that was that recently it's been shown that Claude AI has been able to provide persuasive arguments that pretty much on par with humans, statistically anyway, according to Anthropic, who did the research there. So it does look as though, and there's a number of other bits and pieces of research that you have, that you've seen, which suggests the same, that AI is becoming more and more persuasive, right? So if we're trying to fight this battle on the meme front, those who are using AI maliciously, who have no boundaries as to where they can take their memes because it's not grounded in facts, it can be any sort of fantasy whatsoever. How are we going to convince people of what's right or wrong on the meme front, where their memes are unconstrained by reality? They can be even more fantastical than any memes that's constrained by reality that we can produce, right? So it seems as though it's a difficult battle.
Oh yeah, it's a very difficult battle.
Actually,
Well, let me do a quick answer. I'll do a quick answer because there's a few hands up. Firstly, misinformation is a huge, ubiquitous and complicated problem, and there's no one magic bullet. Like, memes aren't going to get us out of this problem. But they can be one useful tool amongst a suite of tools. What I'm working on is just one tool amongst others. Another thing I'm working on is building people's critical thinking using tools like games, which can get people practicing critical thinking through
You offer
gamification.
Cranky Uncle, a game which you can download today on your phone.
And so what that does is build people's resilience against misinformation techniques. So they can see these manipulative memes or whatever, And again, that's not the magic bullet either. That's just one tool amongst many. And I think that we do need to be developing lots of things, and we need to be developing solutions that are scalable, which is why I've become quite attracted to technical solutions like what we're talking about. But a couple of questions over this side of the...
At the risk of using big words which may be unnecessary, my big concern here is that without a well-founded and agreed epistemology, we're in deep shit. And the reason I say that quite assertedly is most of my life was looking at semantic constructs and trying to make sure that they fit in with the structure of knowledge in a particular domain. If we don't have that structure, that epistemology, you're forever fighting, because it's easy for someone, and my favourite one came 2 days ago, Donald Trump says he's better than Joe Biden because he's won 26 golf tournaments and Biden doesn't play golf. The demything on that was 26 golf tournaments at his Mar-a-Lago estate, where he owns the place and in fact was in fact running the whole conference. So I mean, these are the kind of things. That's an easy one, but my fear is that without an epistemology, which the experts can agree, and there's even disagreement in the experts in this area in particular, we're always going to be fighting an uphill battle. And I'm just wondering, from the experience you've had trying to build these models, do you ever see any form of epistemology coming through that could be helpful?
Well, maybe I should keep going because I think I'm on slide 3. So, and I think some of these questions will get answered. And then some of them will probably be unresolved and we can dig into them deeper, all right? So, all right, getting back on track. We started with the goal of trying to debunk misinformation automatically. We were able to develop a model that detects misinformation, but then once I realized, okay, the psych research tells us that we need to create a debunking like this. How do we go from detecting a claim to producing a debunking according to the fact-myth-fallacy-fact structure? I'll just call it the truth sandwich for short, because that's one of the kind of colloquial phrases. And we started actually about 1 to 2 years ago, playing around with ChatGPT 3.5 and just working on playing around with prompt engineering to try to throw misinformation at it and then see if it could produce a reliable fact-myth-fallacy debunking. And we found that it was just rubbish at accurately spotting the fallacy in misinformation. It did okay with the facts, although the facts tended to be a bit generic, but it just was bad at spotting fallacies. It's just not a critical thinking piece of technology. And so we realized, okay, well, we're going to have to tackle the fallacy problem in a different way. And so we spent about a year, or I don't know, at least half a year, developing a model to detect fallacies. And we took that same supervised machine learning approach we took with our previous model, where we took a whole bunch of examples of climate misinformation and identified what were the fallacies in each one. And then we used that as a training set to train our model. And this, sorry if this is a bit, I don't know, actually this is probably a good audience for this, but this is a confusion matrix which reports how well our model did at spotting different fallacies. And really the most important part is the diagonal black boxes, because they tell you the accuracy or the percentage where it got each fallacy right. So in other words, it was 78% accurate at spotting ad hominem attacks. It was 92% accurate at spotting anecdote fallacies, and so on and so on. The ones where it did badly were ones where we didn't have many training samples. Like it was hard finding, is that false choice or false equivalence? Yeah, false equivalence, it was hard to find examples of that, so it didn't score that well. And then slothful induction was troublesome because it's just a troublesome fallacy. It requires background knowledge in order to spot the fallacy, and that's one of the things we realized during this research was there are two types of fallacies. There are structural fallacies where you can just tell by the pattern of the text Like, for example, a false choice is usually phrased in an either-or kind of way. You're either with us or you're against us, kind of structures, and you can spot those just through the way the text can be arranged. But some, like thoughtful induction or cherry picking, require actually knowing background knowledge. You need to know what is all the evidence available before you can know whether they're cherry picking and ignoring other evidence. And similar with slothful induction, that's the fallacy where people come to a conclusion without considering all the evidence, and you need to know what that evidence is and whether their conclusion contradicts the evidence. So, yes? Oh.
So we need to judge the quality of the evidence that we have as well.
Yes. I mean, again, with what we were looking at were, I would characterize it as kind of the shallow end of the pool, or the low-hanging fruit of climate misinformation. The clear examples where there was a robust body of evidence, lots of different lines of evidence, all pointing to a single conclusion, like human-caused global warming, or just the reality of global warming itself. So these were cases where there was clear science. So we weren't going into the murky areas, like on the edges of knowledge where scientists are still figuring things out. Like during COVID, and you could see that scientists were figuring things out, and they were, you were hearing different messages from the CDC, or sorry, I was living in the US at the time. So I was grateful to be working in climate change, where most of the stuff was answered 20 years ago, whereas with COVID, it was happening in real time. So that's a much more complicated area. So I actually thought about writing a book on COVID misinformation at the time, and I'm really glad that I didn't, because it would have been, I would have given myself a world of pain. And if you want to like check out the model, if you want to stress test it, the URL for the model is up here, sks.to/flicktool. Let's do a test now. Do I have it up here somewhere? I don't. Let's just type it in. So think of a climate myth, because it's trained on climate myths. It's on Hugging Face, which is slow because we're cheap, so we only paid for this. We're just using the free CPU version. That's something we're working on to try to get it. But
how much funding do you need? If there's any billionaires watching this,
yes,
video, how much do you need?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but just
what's a generous amount?
I mean, how much would it cost to have a GPU server? I don't know.
What, 500?
Probably for a millionaire, enough pocket change. So think of a climate myth. We'll pump it into here and see how good it is at spotting the fallacy. Anyone want to suggest one?
Climate myth.
Anyone want to suggest a climate myth?
It's all a hoax.
All right. So let's say
That's generic.
climate change is a hoax. Well, let's just see how it goes. Now, the first time it runs the model, it's slow because it's on a CPU, and it needs to. Once it's run the first time, So while this is running, everyone else think of a different climate myth that you might have heard.
It's good to do the computer science.
So yeah, so it says there's a 93% chance that it's a conspiracy theory. So that and thoughtful induction, because the climate change is actually based on a lot of evidence, and it's ignoring all that evidence. You got one?
Maybe I'm going to have phrased it, but the idea that global warming is actually faulty weather readings from urban heat island effects.
Okay, global warming is actually the result of heat island effect and
urban heat island effects.
Urban heat island effects. Is that a myth?
oh yeah, no, that's a big one. Yeah, global warming is not happening. The warming record is actually an artifact. How does that sound? An artifact. Once I had to design an experiment where I had to write an article of climate misinformation. I just did it on the iPad on the train home and spat out 1,000 words so easy. Like I was like, it would be great to be a climate denier because you just don't have to worry about being accurate. So anyway, let's see how it goes. So it's misrepresentation. So, and slothful induction. So it would probably, and this is eventually, like what we're working towards is not just saying this is a fallacy, but explaining how it's misrepresenting. In this case, it would probably be, yeah, sorry, you're going to say?
I know, well, you finish your point. You misspelled artifact. I think it'll be very interesting to see if it has a different result if you put an I instead of the E.
Is that how you, because
I
there's,
think they're two different spellings.
There one is
so there's
No,
artifact.
but if it's an arbitrary change in text, would give a different.
I doubt it.
No.
Slight.
That's within the noise. That's good. I approve. I just thought that would be very interesting if like a completely different thing was put up the top if you changed one letter.
Right.
It's a good stress test, and you won.
Anyone want to do another one?
That global warming is a natural part of the weather cycle.
Okay, that's a good one. Global warming is a natural part of the weather cycle.
You've got not in there.
Oh, whoops. Still. Single cause. So there's a lot of arguments where it's saying global warming is just natural factors and ignoring other factors like human causation. So where it tends to see just blaming global warming on one thing, it tends to characterize it as single cause. Anyway, I don't want to get too distracted by this. Let me jump back into the slides. So anyway, you can have a play around with that. It's as the confusion matrix shows, there's still room for improvement, but it's actually, these results are about 2 to 3 times better than previous fallacy detection research, which is all 20 to 40% accurate. It's bad. It's
How do you assess the accuracy of that? How do you check the results?
So what we have was we had a training set of 2,500 examples, and then we just subdivide that into a test set and a training set. Well, sorry, it's more like a test set and a training set. And so the test set was what we used to assess, like to obtain the confusion matrix. So we're just comparing the classifiers answers to what a human, me, said was the fallacy. So yeah, like ideally you would have multiple. You'd have 2 or 3 fallacy experts doing it, and then do integrated reliability, and then have a gold standard data set. Fallacy experts are hard to come by, so we just went with a single person in this case. But yeah, that's something we're working on as well. All right, so we once we had developed our model to detect fallacies, and we actually submitted the paper to a journal Monday, so it was just this week. But then we, given that just using ChatGPT by itself was not good at fallacies, then we decided, okay, let's do a LLM prompt where, so we're still, and I think we started with ChatGPT, but then we started using cheaper, smaller, open access LLMs. But then we wanted to put some dynamic information, which is the red text, into our prompt. So we were basically spoon feeding it, all right, write this debunking, fact, myth, fallacy, but the fallacy is oversimplification. And so we were just helping along by giving it some of that extra information. And also the first model that I talked about with those 5 categories, we also, what misinformation claim it detected there, we also put that information into our prompt. So we were basically trying to just go one step more sophisticated with our generative AI prompt by packing the prompt with some dynamic information coming from all these other models that we developed. And what we found was and we did it. We started with ChatGPT, but we knew that was never going to be our endpoint because OpenAI charge for every time you use it. And if we wanted to create a scalable solution, we wouldn't be able to afford it, basically. So we once it was working well in ChatGPT, then we went to a simpler model. Palm 2 was the model that we used. But we found that it was garbling the fact-myth-fallacy-fact structure. It got a bit confused sometimes, or it glitched, and sometimes it would do like multiple facts or get it kind of arranged in a jumbled fashion. And so then we went to a third model, which was multiple prompts. And so now, and this is looking a bit complicated. The basics of it was we would do a prompt for the first fact and then a prompt to recategorize the myth, and then another prompt to explain the fallacy, and then a fourth prompt for the fact. But we also pulled in some information from outside sources as well to help with writing the fact. So this makes me a little bit queasy, but we were just doing a Google search, asking for factual information relevant to the myth. And then there was a database called Climate Fever, which actually has a whole set of statements categorized as either factual or misinformation. And we also drew on that for the final fact in our model. So these were our two models. One was a single prompt, Palm 2, and here was a 4 prompt, and we were using Mixtral, was our LLM in this case. I don't recall why, but the research assistant found that Palm 2 wasn't working very well in this context. Or Mixtral was, I think he just did a matrix search and found that Mixtral was the best performing model. Now what? All right, and so then last Friday we had to submit a paper to a conference, and we're just halfway through this research, but we had to submit something. And so I said to my colleagues, and we were talking about it, and thought, we know that peer reviewers are going to say, why didn't you just do a single ChatGPT prompt? Why are you doing all these super complicated models? So we thought, well, we should do that as well, and then we can compare the 3 approaches. And I joked to my colleagues, wouldn't it suck if after all the 2 years of work that we've done developing a fallacy detection model and all these things, if the latest version of ChatGPT outperformed the stuff that we're doing. And so we did it with GPT-4, I think. Not 4.0, this was before that came out. I think it was 4 Turbo is what it was called. And we did prompts like, this is what it looked like. This was our GPT prompt. So, and all the prompts were structured and worded similar to this. So it was like defining the role has a big influence on the output that it does. And then we would instruct it to do the fact-myth-fallacy debunking. And then we'd provide some more specific instructions on what we wanted to see in each of those sections. And then we gave it the myth at the end. And also we had a table where we listed all the fallacies and the definitions of each fallacy. And then we ran all the same myths with GPT-4, and we found that it was doing just as well as our most complicated model. And we were like, shit. So from 3.5 to 4, somehow they taught it critical thinking. Like they taught it how to spot fallacies, and it's they did something. I don't know. Maybe it was Scarlett Johansson's voice or something. So here's an example of the different outputs. Here is a myth saying that the sun is causing global warming, basically, and here is just the GPT single prompt. Here is the Palm 2 single prompt with some dynamic information. And then here is the 4 prompt solution with dynamic information, and it's pulling stuff from all over the place. And in this case, this is just to give you a rough example of how they did. The Palm 2 tended to be simplistic. a bit generic. GPT and Mixtral both were roughly equal. In this particular case, Mixtral actually does a better job of identifying that replacement fact. It's not just saying the sun can't be doing it, it's saying it's actually human activities. So it's doing a better job of identifying that fact that dislodges the myth. And all of them did pretty good with the fallacy. In fact, the thing I like best about this research is how well it does at explaining fallacies. And this is a little set of bar charts, just comparing the three models where we basically graded it. Like the four researchers working on this project, including myself, we graded each section of each debunking, the facts, the first fact, the second fact, and the fallacy. And then just this is the average result across all four of us. And we found that basically GPT and Mixtral were good, roughly equal at the fact, and then roughly equal at the second fact as well, one slightly above in either way. It kind of washes out. And then Mixtral slightly outperforms GPT-4 on the fallacy. So if it was it's kind of almost a dead heat, but you know, the fact that Mixtral is so complicated and then GPT just kind of slouches its way into the room and nails it first go, it kind of pisses me off a bit. And then the Palm 2 model doesn't do as well in all cases. So I think just the next thing, like, because we're still halfway through this, but what we still need to do is just tweak the models a bit, because we saw things where it didn't do as well as we would like. It's not ideal that the researchers assess or do the annotations to grade the models output. So we've actually recruited a bunch of people to like 9 different people are going to go through all our debunkings and grade them. And the interesting thing is they all have quite a different level of climate literacy. There's some people who are professional climate scientists and some people who are just kind of into the subject. Because we think that the climate expertise is a big factor in how good you are at grading the quality of a debunking, because they will just know things, background information that a non-climate scientist wouldn't know.
Could you red team this by pulling in a bunch of lunatic climate deniers to grade it all and see if you can detect which ones are the bad scoring? So.
And what would you get out from that? Why would you do that?
If you pollute the grading mechanism, can you, how do you know that the grading isn't biased? So how do you know?
Right.
You're relying on expertise, prima facie. The expertise is what counts as the validity of the grading.
The general metric you use is inter-rater reliability. So if you have one person who's an outlier compared to everyone else, then you have a closer look. Why is that person scoring differently? Are they biased? Are they incompetent? Are they not paying attention or whatever? So, and that's probably how we're going to approach it when we have a whole bunch of people. My instinct is that you'll probably see the climate experts show high reliability with each other and the non-experts show reliability with each other, but probably low reliability between them. That's what I anticipate, but we'll have to run the experiment and see what we get. Yes?
So did you call that comparison reliability, or what was it?
It's inter-rater reliability. So basically just imagine you have two people who just score, they'll just do a score. Like in this case, we just look at every fact and we score it from 1 or 0 to 3. And so it's just seeing, I score 1, 3, 2, 3, and then Fred scores 1, 4, 3, there's no 4, but and then you can just run those numbers through a inter-rater reliability function, and it'll tell you between 0 to 1 how reliable, what's the inter-rater reliability, how much do you agree with each other. There are several different metrics you can use, even just agreement, like percentage agreement, but and which measure you use depends on the context. But yeah, we just used a standard iterative reliability measure. Yes.
I thought of a way in which maybe it could be useful to like have, climate deniers or whatever, people who are not a part of the general scene, commenting on it just in the sense of if you give them a direction to try and answer the questions as if they were a climate scientist, it might be interesting to be able to see the extent to which someone who doesn't believe can stereotype in their heads and model what a believer would say. That there could be an interesting part in that in terms of like what is the orthodoxy of the scene as opposed to what an expert says.
Yeah,
so
it's getting very meta now.
So someone who doesn't believe could then, if they could tell you exactly what a supposed expert would say, it slightly suggests that that's the dogma of that discipline rather than the actual truth.
So
at least it's a signal in that direction.
There's two things we want to know. Firstly, is the output from the model accurate and reliable? And that's what this is all about. And that's why you probably need experts to grade the quality of the output. But then the second question, and really the more important, well, once you've satisfied yourself that you've got an accurate model, then the next question is, does this work out in the real world in debunking misinformation? If you take the output from your model and deploy it in some way, and that's an open question on what that looks like, will that actually reduce misperceptions and stop misinformation from spreading? And that's once we get past these hurdles, once we kind of solve the little thing of the holy grail, then we will start doing psychology research on, does this actually, is it effective, accurate, and then effective? And that's where you start getting climate deniers or conspiracy theorists or just people from diverse backgrounds to look at the output. So did you have a question?
Yeah, could I ask you to go back about 3 slides to the outputs from the model? That's the one. That's the one. When I look at that, and I'm going to take a very naive perspective on this, if my mother was saying, "Oh no, it's the bloody sun, that's what's causing it," I would probably go with Palm 2 because she could get her head around.
Right. I mean, this is a really good question.
And I think that one of the issues we have here, and this is why we had good old Mikey going about experts can't be trusted, is because experts will deliver facts in a way that they understand them based on their discipline. That does not equate necessarily to Joe Blow in the street who doesn't get it at all.
Yeah.
And I think what you've got here, and this is what fascinated me more actually, is I totally agree with what you said, but when I'm looking at messaging, Palm 2 is kind of, I'm saying, you could probably take that to most people in the street and they would kind of get what you're saying. Mixed trial, you take that to the people when you've got, 0.3 of what? You're already challenging some base assumptions people will have.
Yeah.
So I get what you're saying, but I think the problem with expert messages, they sound like a bunch, and
No, just tell us what you think.
It sounds like a bunch of eggheads who've got together in a room and come up with the complete opposite to the meme that you were talking about earlier. Instead of make America great again, and I'll use it because it's crap. They instead say it would be a very good idea, based on the evidence that we have today, looking at the graphs that we've exposed here, that maybe there's a chance if we. No, that's not going to stick. And I think this is going to be your other problem.
No, it's. I mean, and we just touched on that because we are just trying to solve the problem of accurate. We're not even thinking about effective yet. So this is accurate. This is probably more effective, right?
I think this is going to be your balancing point, the two axes.
And generative AI is actually a really good tool for that kind of thing. Like often when I'm designing experiments and I need a message to put in an experiment and I'm feeling lazy, I'll just get ChatGPT or Gemini to give me 1,000 words of this argument. And then it's like, it's not that good. Explain it, repeat that, but at a 12-year-old level. And then I'll just try a 14-year-old level, 16, and it does, you try different levels and it gives you different outputs, and some of them are really good at explaining and some not. So I think that once we solve the accurate problem, then we will do the effective problem, and that is a psychology question, and that's where you probably need to, probably what I imagine, and this is again I think a power of AI, is you can tailor it to your audience. So someone might be more comfortable with this, and another person might be more comfortable with that, and you can.
Then politically you get ripped apart.
Well, it depends on how you do it, and transparency. Like you need to
change the message. Anyone, especially the right-wing populists who are very good at this, they'll say, yeah, okay, you say you're saying the same things, but it doesn't correlate, it doesn't do this and that. And there is one of the big problems you've got. The attack lines become open. And again, please, I'm not disagreeing.
No. These are all the things that we are just beginning to grapple with, because that question is then the next question after effective. Like we're still inaccurate, then we will work out in the lab effective. Then we have to figure out how do you actually deploy this in the real world, and that could look like a million different things, and that's where you grapple with those kind of issues and how people respond to it. How do you want to be transparent? You want to do it in a way that, like for example, the fallacy detection. I like that it reports the probability. So it's not like I'm saying this is the answer. We're saying there's a 90% chance that this is conspiracy theory. So, those kinds of reporting methods are ways that you can make something more transparent and I think potentially more acceptable.
I just wonder if there's a demographic for the mad auntie who's only believes in what her friend Alice says.
I mean, there was a study published just within the last month where they used ChatGPT to talk to conspiracy theorists, and they would say, what's your conspiracy theory or something, and then they would say 9/11 was an inside job or something, and then and they'd give an argument for it, and then the ChatGPT would generate 1,000-word answer. Well, that point you make, and then it would kind of explain what all the facts are relevant to that, and then the person goes, well, what about this? And then it would do another 1,000-word answer, and what they found was that intervention, like having ChatGPT directly replying to the specific arguments that the person was making, had more effect in reducing conspiracy beliefs than I can't think of anything else that has been done in a scientific experiment. And then it stuck. Like when they tested weeks later, they still had reduced belief in the conspiracy theory, because often you find it just fades over time.
You have to see a real longitudinal stuff.
Yeah, it was this. I mean, this had a longitudinal element to it, and the thing that jumped out at me from this research was the conspiracy theorists reported afterwards, I felt heard, because it was responding directly to specific arguments that they were making. Yes.
John, I want to ask a question. So people have different brains, and different brains will react differently to the information that you give them. For example, my boyfriend was telling me that there's about 20% of people who we call conservative, and they have a different brain structure that what you say to them cannot get through. They're not I don't know whether
there are some scientific studies that correlate different brains with things like flight response.
They also have higher
can't
disgust.
get that through to them because they cannot be that receptive to your new ideas. So how can we get them to be receptive?
Well, I mean, generally, it's a universal human condition that people resist information that contradicts their beliefs. So whether they're conservative or liberal, religious or I don't know, but definitely religious. But people, you say something that challenges someone's beliefs, or their social identity, and that they will resist it. In fact, social identity is arguably stronger. Like during my psychology PhD, I came out of that thinking that beliefs were the big thing. And then I moved to the US and spent 4 years, where my 4 years in the US directly overlapped with the 4 years of the Trump administration. And I learnt that tribality or social identity is even stronger than beliefs, because we saw how beliefs just shifted when the tribal leader says, no, we don't believe that anymore, we believe this. And everyone was like, okay, all right, we'll believe that. So, so it's when you are communicating information that goes against people's beliefs or tribal identity, then it's going to be difficult. And climate change is an example. And in a way, it's almost a rational response, in the sense that just imagine you, all your community, your family, your social group, all think that climate change is a hoax. And then I come and say, hey, that's actually not true, and here's all the evidence for climate change. You should accept, the climate science. For that person, they would have to then go against everyone that they know and love and live with and suffer the consequences of that. And so there's a lot of disincentive to go against your social identity when everyone believes something, and then you're given information that contradicts those beliefs. So, so there is, I'm a scientist, I'm a big believer in communicating facts, but I also acknowledge that the science tells us that facts can be limited in some contexts like that. And one reason why I actually got into the whole critical thinking and fallacy way of approaching misinformation was because the first experiment I did in my PhD, I was just blundering around trying different things, and I tried explaining a misleading technique in some climate misinformation. And this is almost a quirk of the experiment design, but the misinformation was about the scientific consensus on climate change and the fact that there's 97% agreement amongst climate scientists that humans are causing global warming. But I knew from previous research that just mentioning the scientific consensus is really powerful, because humans are social animals, and that expert consensus is a social message. So I had to try to inoculate people against misinformation about the consensus without mentioning the consensus. It was kind of, now I'm thinking of Fawlty Towers and the don't mention the war, but the two people laugh in the room. And so the way I tackled that was I explained the technique used in the climate misinformation without mentioning climate change, and instead I used tobacco misinformation as an example using the same technique. So basically I was saying, look out for this technique, fake experts. The tobacco industry used to do it, and here's a little 1950s newspaper ad with a guy in a white coat smoking and telling you that smoking soothes the throat, and that's a fake expert. So look out for fake experts. And then I showed them climate misinformation that used fake experts. And that was one group in my experiment. And then with the other group, I showed them just the misinformation by itself. What I found was the climate misinformation by itself worked much stronger on political conservatives. So it really reduced their belief, which was already low, and it took it even lower. So the misinformation had a polarizing effect. It worked more on conservatives than it did people on the left. But when I did the tobacco inoculation, look out for this technique, then I showed them the climate misinformation. The misinformation didn't work at all across the political spectrum. It was just completely neutralized. And what that told me was, regardless of where people sit on the political spectrum and what their beliefs are, nobody likes being misled. And so that, I thought, maybe there's something in this whole critical thinking approach. It's a way to sidestep those cultural or belief or social identity barriers by just appealing to people's aversion to being misled. And so I did a lot of psychology research about fallacies and critical thinking. And then when I started working with the computer scientists, I brought all that research into trying to incorporate it in the AI research as well. So that's why like fallacies are such a key part. And I'm loving that it actually does best at fallacies out of all the different elements of a debunking. Yes?
Has anyone done research similar to you, but on anti-vaccination? I work for a medical research Institute, and it's something that we need to deal with from time to time. Has anyone?
I mean, there's a lot of people doing vaccine misinformation research.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm doing besides AI work is using games to build people's critical thinking. It's called Cranky Uncle. Adam mentioned it earlier. And the Cranky Uncle game focuses on climate misinformation. But then after we released the Cranky Uncle game, UNICEF approached us and said, can we do a vaccine version of it? Because it's just a critical thinking game. And all the same fallacies that you see in climate misinformation are also being used in vaccine misinformation. So we just took the same game and then identified the top 10 fallacies in vaccine misinformation. 8 of them were already in the climate cranky game. The 2 that we added were false cause, or another word for that is post hoc ergo propter hoc. In other words, this thing happened and then that thing happened, so this must have caused that. A kid got vaccinated, then they got autism, so vaccines must cause autism. So that was actually the number one argument. And the second one was appeal to nature, or we call it natural is best in the game, which is that natural remedies are better than vaccines, or should be used instead of. So Cranky Uncle vaccine came out last year, I think. The problem is, both games are like smartphone games, but you can only play the vaccine game in Ghana, Uganda, or Kenya currently.
Oh, okay.
Maybe Tanzania. But the browser version you can play anywhere. So if you go to crankyunclevaccine.org and click on the browser button, you can play that game. But there are other people working in vaccine, and I'm collaborating with.
Why is it limited to those regions?
So UNICEF are interested in raising vaccination rates in the global south, in specific parts of the world. And so basically at the beginning, we just kind of put the call out to all the different UNICEF offices, and the countries that were most engaging with, in terms of, because what we wanted to do was, like the original Cranky Uncle, it's so white. It's like, it's just criminally white. And so we wanted to make sure that a game in the global south looked like the people who would be using the game. And so we ran co-design workshops in the countries that were interested and were able to help us run co-design workshops. So Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda were the first 3. Then we went over to Ghana and Tanzania. And then we did a Pakistan version, which isn't out yet because translating the game into Urdu has been a nightmare. And no, I'm not just talking about right to left technical issues, it's just the language. Like, I think it was more an organizational thing than a cultural thing. But yeah, we're still working on that. But yeah, it was really that UNICEF are interested in specific parts of the world, and B, it was important that we went through a rigorous co-design process in each country. So that's why it's just in these specific countries so far. We're hoping to do Latin America and Middle East and Caribbean over the next year or 2, if we can get funding. Yes.
I love your last section about deploy. What does that mean in the real world? Do you, like, every time somebody posts disinformation or misinformation on social media, do you like give them 1,000 words?
Right, and so this is kind of a bit of a Steve Jobsy kind of reference, right? Like, it's just one last little thing that we got to do, because when we started the Holy Grail, I thought, once we've solved detection, it's job done. And then I realized the psych research, and I should have known, meant that it was actually a lot. You climbed over that first summit, and then there was a much bigger summit. Once we've got over that summit and we've used generative AI to create accurate debunkings, or even accurate and effective debunkings that work well in the lab, then how do you deploy it? We haven't even got to that point, but I have a feeling that's going to be the next huge summit. What does that look like? I think that could be a lot of different things. One thing that we worked on at Monash was a browser extension where as you look at a web page, it uses our initial detection model to scan the text, and if it identifies any climate misinformation, it then highlights it, and then it pops up a debunking. So people could just be, as they're browsing, it'll identify misinformation and let you know how it misleads. So that's one thing. Like a bot that just responds is another thing, but I don't think that that's going to fly very well.
A Twitter bot, I reckon Elon Musk would be right in for that.
No, I think he would lose his shit over it, actually.
Yes.
Here's all the disinformation.
Not if it was. So, yeah, I've given his politics, I think that he'd probably be opposed to our goals.
Right. But, well, I mean, like, can you approach Facebook again, see if they're interested in having tagging posts on Facebook? Like, how accurate is it? Are you worried about it being wrong in some cases? And
that's where we're at now, is the accuracy. Like, it has to be highly accurate before you would want to deploy it out in the real world. And so
Finding a whole load of people.
you need a fact checker to debunk it.
yeah.
Who's fact checking the fact checkers?
Right. Yeah. So did you have a question?
Well, it's actually apropos, because I was going to say, but maybe, what do you think of community notes on Twitter? Because that's the most real implementation I've seen. And also, I think that also has an interesting directionality, because I find that works really quite well, because there's the implication that ultimately that's some bloke's opinion. There's a degree of aggregation in community notes, but it's kind of a dude said that, and it's other people who are apt to disagree with him said, yeah, that seems about right. So it's like, there's like, a little, because it seems to work very often where like someone says something that straight up isn't true, there's usually a community notes saying, nah, actually, it's this.
Yeah.
And it's straightforward. And there's skin in the game in that sense, and an inbuilt skepticism, because it is just that dude. So I think there might be a problem in this, in the sense of even just in the sense of it has a pretension to be the truth. It just irks people wrong, just socially. Like, it's almost like it automatically comes across as if it were a person, it would be arrogant.
Right.
So in order for us to deal with it, we almost have to personalize it in some way. We have to give it some identity. It has to present in some way. It can't literally be 1,000 words that just pops up at the bottom of every post because no one would read it.
Or it's seen as the voice of the authoritarian regime.
Well, that's it. And that's it. Whereas Community Notes doesn't have that problem.
But there are fact-checking groups already set up in the reporting industry, particularly left-wing or left-wing press. So The Guardian has a complete team dedicated to fact-checking.
Yeah, but they're consistently wrong.
Well, but at least
they're like radically wrong all the time, in fact.
Well, I won't...
Joe Biden isn't senile, according to them, so what can you say? If it's politically inconvenient, it's not true. This is why you need this automated stuff. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
So I think, again, I'll come back to epistemology. But ignoring that for a second, there are groups that are being set up to do fact-checking. And I think this is the kind of thing you could deploy into those guys first, because they're the ones who've got the real-world contact. They're the ones who can help you refine this effectiveness of the message.
Right. So that's another potential tool would be like that flick tool I showed you. Just imagine just a simple web page where people just enter some text and it just spits out a response. It's almost a Wikipedia, take it with a grain of salt, but here is our best guess starting point type resource. So that could be something that fact checkers could use as a resource, particularly, and we haven't even looked at this yet, but if you could have it linking to resources. But again, this is the stage 3 stuff. We're still in stage 1, yes. and stage 3 is how do you deploy it in a way that makes it effective? And these are all the questions that we haven't even been discussing.
I guess I'm suggesting that down the line, in practice, it's a lot of it's social, a lot of it's marketing, presentation.
Yes, yeah, and so funnily enough, like last week I was meeting with a guy who works for a tech company, and he was asking me, like I was explaining this research, and he says, how would you do it? And I said, this is my idea. And he goes, no, that won't work. And then he started throwing out ideas, and we realized that there were just so many ways you could configure this and organize it. And it really does require like not just the egghead boffins like me, but the practitioners, people who do this stuff, interface with the public for a living. I think you need to get all those people in a room with a whiteboard and just hashing out possible solutions, and that's probably what we're going to do sometime down the track.
It strikes me that you're going to be fighting a Cold War where the disinformation AIs are going to massively outnumber and have an easier job being fake experts than you'll ever be being a real expert. You'll just be one voice of the truth in an ocean of lies.
See, if I could add to that though, but then it suggests that the way to beat that is to tag the generative stuff, which you're talking about too, an authoritative voice that people trust. So you can build the brand of a trusted human being who can leverage this expanded data set.
I think we need to sort of stop trust in human beings so much, because human beings are kind of crazy sometimes, especially when they're politically affiliated. I think, the best way to sort of generate trust in this is grounding it in the best solid evidence that we have, the most verified, peer-reviewed, replicated experiments that we can, ground as much as we can in empiricism.
Any comments on that? I saw some head shakes.
I don't trust machines.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've tried flame warring overly these people, and they hate experts. They don't like facts. Anyone that comes and argues with facts, not an ad hominem attack, is clearly the enemy.
I mean, part of the reason for that is, like I was saying, ad hominem attacks against experts are prevalent. Like they're a big part of misinformation in all topics. We saw it during the pandemic, or attacks on like Anthony Fauci and so on. But while there is declining trust in experts, they are still one of, or if not the most trusted expert on, like in the case of climate change, climate scientists are the most trusted source, even if trust is declining in them. So they still.
What are you trying to convince with these? Are you trying to convince the people who already trust the experts, or are you trying to convince the people who don't trust experts?
And so the way I look at that question is there are different audiences with different goals. And a simple way that I look at it is grouping the public into three groups. The people who are already convinced about climate change, but are inactive, like they just don't talk about it, don't do anything about it. The undecided, disengaged, and then your dismissive, cranky uncles. So the concerned people are about slightly over half the population. So they're actually most of the public. But most of those people don't even talk about climate change with their friends and family because they think that no one else is concerned about it. And so with that group, the goal for climate communicators like me is activating them in some way. Like activating even just to the point, not getting them necessarily turning them into Greta Thunberg and marching down the streets, but even just talking to people makes a big difference. It's probably the most important thing a person can do to contribute to climate action is just to talk about it and build social momentum. With the disengaged group, for me, in terms of looking at it through the lens of misinformation, it's about building their immunity against misinformation and then moving them into the concerned group. And with the dismissives, as we've looked at, it's very difficult to change someone's mind if they're dismissive about climate science because they don't trust the information. You can beat your head against that brick wall if you want to, but it takes so much resources to do it. But generally, I think that given that they're only like 10% or less of the population, we're better off spending our energy on the other 90%.
Right. I guess depending on how gerrymandering is done, that 10% can really make a difference in some regions. So, I mean, weren't you saying that the large language model, the ChatGPT sledgehammer essays that would respond to misinformation claims, that was effective against people who were pretty skeptical of climate change or vaccines?
It was conspiracy theorists. So I don't think I don't think climate was a topic, but
okay. But would you consider these conspiracy theorists as being part of that 10% of people who aren't really interested in evidence?
The Venn diagram of conspiracy theorists and climate deniers has a lot of overlap. So if you deny the scientific consensus on climate change, that means you disagree with, the global community of scientists, inevitably you're going to resort to conspiracy theories to explain that. Otherwise, they're all accidentally wrong in the same direction. And conspiracy theories are more plausible. Yeah?
Yes. Last question for me. If we are not trying to put our resources in changing the dismissers, can we try and neutralize them in some way that they don't spread their influence because they can be contagious?
I mean, that question is really what my whole research career has been about. Now, I've mentioned the word inoculation a couple of times. It's actually, in psychology, there's inoculation theory, which is the idea that by exposing people to a weakened version of misinformation, you can build up their immunity so that when they encounter the actual misinformation, they're less likely to be misled. So the analogy I use for climate denial or other forms of science denial is polio. It's an incurable disease, but we were able to almost completely eradicate it just by building up the public's immunity to the point that you got herd immunity. So I think the answer to your question is, if we can inoculate enough of the public, by inoculate I mean build up their critical thinking so that they can spot attempts to mislead them, then if you could do that sufficiently that you got herd immunity, then that misinformation would become eradicated. It would no longer be relevant in the world.
But misinformation is intelligent, right? People craft this. At least the misinformation generators are intelligent. They can craft and they can find out what the tactics is behind
But not
misinformation
necessarily,
busting.
just because they're under selection.
But polio isn't, right? That's just selection pressure, really.
The funny thing is, the most popular climate misinformation arguments are the dumbest.
Well, there's economic reasons for intelligent misinformation campaigns.
Or political reasons for
And
disinformation.
political, well, that's also...
But the arguments that hold sway, or the ones that stick, are the simplest ones.
Okay.
Climate scientists are in it for the money. It's cold, therefore global warming isn't real. It's just the real basic arguments.
Do you
I think
predict
you
that?
could pick that up though.
Do you predict that there could be a rise of more sophisticated misinformation campaigns, or do you think that they'll just remain not very sophisticated?
I'm not saying they're not. Like, I was at a misinformation conference in Singapore, and it blew me away, some of the stuff that's going. Like, the thing that really got to me was like the use of bots, because I had this idea that bots were just throwing out bullshit on Twitter or whatever. They're that sophisticated that they have a social structure. So you have bots that are like some bots generate the misinformation, and then other bots amplify it. And there's actually, they have a community of bots, and sometimes the bots they also have these kind of temporal strategies where all they're doing is just not trying to make people believe wrong things. They're just trying to create more polarization and getting people in a heightened state of being pissed off at each other, and then get them to a certain point of polarization, and then they hit with the misinformation.
That's a standard tactic. It's been around. I mean, you can go back to the Second World War. You destabilise people's basic beliefs, and then you present them with some options which feel more tenable in the context of the time they're in. The other thing, and I think this came from over that side of the table, the amount of money being put into disinformation by political parties, large climate deniers, and I mean most of the utility companies, certainly that I've seen in the US and in Oz.
I think it's the tobacco industry, how much money they put into disinformation.
And when you look at the amount they're putting in compared to the amount of money that's being put into good research, like the stuff you're doing, we're 2 or 3 orders of magnitude different. And that will in the end cause a swamping kind of gear. And I think this is one of the big issues, is that, I mean, I'll use Trump. I mean, I wish Trump was a bot. He'd find a way of turning him off. But the reality there is you've got people believing the complete bullshit because he comes across, and I'm not going to say anything about Biden other than he comes across as being more personable than Joe Biden. I mean, he's a criminal, he's a crook, all of those things. And in the end, it's his messaging. It's narrative and the way he constructs things, which people are buying into. Any critical thinker, if you look at 95% of what he says, it's easy to dismiss. That's the thing that worries me. I think if I come back to the investment being made and the fact that most people don't think, let alone critically think, is my big fear, because I see an awful lot of people like lemmings from the Disney film. They're all happily marching towards the edge of the cliff because Jimmy down the road, whose aunt works with Fred, who's the one who's in charge in government to do all this, says this is all right. And that is a very difficult thing to break. It's not just climate change, it's across the spectrum. And we're called, in a way, I think we've mislabeled ourselves. I think as hominids, we can't claim to be the sentient kind. Sometimes we're completely dumbass. But I think we're in a position now where the flood of information, and there's a great book called The Loss of Narrative by a German author, Chinese German author, who's saying that basically narratives are now controlled by the tech bros. If you look for something, you go to Google, it'll give you a listed set of things it thinks you want, but backed also by bias that's built into the algorithms already there. So already our thinking's being controlled. And I think you've got an issue then that when you're competing against that, regardless of how good the information is, and I think which is why I like your last bullet so much. It's at least optimistic. And I think
You're fighting the like a disinformation. You're
Usual.
fighting with evil. Yeah, you're doing the good thing.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Well, how do we know? I mean, like he says, he's
It's going to be
he might be on the bad side.
well, I mean, and like that's pretty fucking depressing, actually, everything you just said. But you got to have a crack, don't you? So and if you don't, then it'll be even worse. So if there weren't, like one thing is we do see, even with like climate misinformation is one of, if not the most well-funded misinformation campaign in human history, like billions of dollars spent by the fossil fuel industry. And yet when you look at public surveys, all the metrics are just gradually going up in terms of acceptance of climate science and climate change and support for climate solutions. So the scientists are winning, just not as quickly as we would have liked, because it's the slowdown because of the misinformation.